The night had all the makings of a fairy tale. A luxurious ballroom, chandeliers casting golden light across crystal glasses and black tie guests, a string quartet playing softly in the background. It was the annual gala of Stratton & Blake Capital, one of the most prestigious investment firms on the East Coast. Julia had spent hours preparing. Her emerald green dress hugged her figure perfectly, her hair swept up in a timeless chignon. She wasn't just the CEO's wife tonight. She was hoping, perhaps foolishly, to reclaim some lost connection with the man she once adored. But from the moment she stepped into the venue, something felt off. The hush that followed her entrance wasn't admiration, it was discomfort, almost like shame. As she passed clusters of employees and their partners, she caught whispers. Not the kind that make you blush with flattery. No, these were jagged. "That's her, the Ice Queen," someone murmured, just low enough for plausible deniability but loud enough to sting. "No wonder he found someone else," came another. Julia's smile remained frozen, brittle. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the marble as she scanned the room for Daniel, her husband of 12 years. When she finally spotted him near the bar, he was laughing, head tilted toward a tall blonde in a red satin dress. Julia's stomach tightened. She recognized the woman, Vanessa, Daniel's executive assistant. The rumors had been swirling for months, but Julia had always dismissed them as gossip fueled by envy. Now, the way Vanessa's hand lingered on his arm left little room for doubt. As Julia approached, the laughter ceased. Daniel looked at her, not with warmth, but with mild surprise, as if she were an unwanted guest. "Julia," he said curtly, giving her a tight nod. Vanessa, on the other hand, smirked. "Oh, you're her," Vanessa said loudly, her voice cutting through the ambient music. "The frigid wife who can't satisfy him." Several heads turned. Julia felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from pure shock. Before she could respond, Vanessa turned to the nearby security guard, who hesitated, then took a step forward as if unsure what to do. "Security," she said, enunciating slowly like she was speaking to a child. "Please remove this woman. She doesn't belong here." The silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke. No one defended her. Daniel looked away, pretending to check his phone. The guard hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. Julia stared at Vanessa for a long moment, then turned to Daniel. "I see," she said quietly, loud and clear. Without raising her voice, without tears, she walked away, past the gawking employees, past the orchestra, past the glittering champagne glasses. She didn't look back. But inside, something cracked. And from that crack, a plan began to bloom. This wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. Not behind closed doors, not whispered between lawyers or in late-night arguments. No, this was public, intentional, and vicious. And she would respond not with tears or screaming, but with precision. Outside the venue, the air was crisp. Julia took a deep breath, her hands no longer trembling. Her phone buzzed with a message from the car service. As she stepped into the black SUV waiting for her at the curb, she made her first call of the night. "Hi, Paul," she said calmly to her attorney. "I'll need you to initiate the exit protocols we discussed last year. Everything. No delays." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The vehicle pulled away from the party, leaving behind glitter and laughter and whispered cruelty. Julia stared out the window, her reflection steady in the glass. They thought she was useless. They thought she was irrelevant. But they had forgotten one thing. Julia Stratton was quiet, not powerless. And she was just getting started. Julia hadn't felt truly visible in years, not in the eyes of her husband, and certainly not within the world he'd built without her. But even in her darkest moments, she never imagined being discarded so publicly, so deliberately. As the car pulled away from the gala, her mind spun with everything that had just happened. Vanessa's voice echoed in her ears. Frigid, useless, remove this woman. Each word had been delivered with the kind of smug confidence only someone with unchecked power could wield. And Daniel? Daniel had said nothing, not a single word in her defense. He hadn't even flinched. The man she'd supported through 2 bankruptcies, stood by when no one believed in his vision, shared a bed with for over a decade. He had treated her like an afterthought. But it hadn't started that night. No, this was just the culmination. For months, maybe longer, the signs were there. Missed calls, last-minute cancellations, hushed conversations that stopped the moment she entered the room. Julia had tried to rationalize it all. He was stressed. The company was expanding. Maybe he was just tired. But now she saw it for what it truly was. Betrayal layered in calculated disrespect. She remembered a moment just 2 weeks earlier, standing in their walk-in closet, noticing a pair of cufflinks she'd gifted him for their 10th anniversary missing. "Oh, I must have left them at the office," he had said casually. The same office where Vanessa spent most of her nights working overtime. And now Vanessa had stepped beyond whispers and innuendo. She had declared war. That look on her face when she ordered Julia removed from the room? It wasn't just arrogance. It was ownership. Vanessa believed she had won, that Julia was no longer a threat, that she could stomp on her with stilettos and not face a single consequence. That smug sneer, the way she leaned into Daniel like a victor claiming a prize. It wasn't just an insult. It was an invitation for Julia to disappear quietly. But Vanessa didn't understand the rules of the game she had entered. Julia might have worn silk and smiled politely, but she had sat in boardrooms before. She knew contracts, she understood asset structures, and she had spent years quietly managing the back-end finances of Daniel's company because he wasn't good with the details. What Vanessa didn't know, what Daniel seemed to have forgotten, was that Julia owned 17% of Stratton and Blake Capital, not as a symbolic gift, not as a formality, but as an original investor and silent partner. She had never flaunted it. She never needed to. Until now. That humiliation in the ballroom had flipped a switch. Julia didn't scream. She didn't throw her drink or cause a scene. That's what Vanessa had wanted. That's what Daniel had expected. But instead, Julia had simply walked away. And that, ironically, terrified them far more than any outburst would have. Because silence, true, strategic silence, meant something was coming. Something cold. Something deliberate. Vanessa had fired the first shot. Julia wasn't going to return it with a bullet. No. She was going to bring the entire battlefield down on them both. And she would do it while wearing pearls. That night, back at the house they once called a home, Julia walked into the master bedroom and opened the drawer where Daniel kept his spare phone. He thought she didn't know about it. He was wrong. She entered the passcode, his birthday, of course, and began scrolling through messages, pictures, dinner reservations, hotel confirmations, dozens of love notes, each more nauseating than the last. Vanessa wasn't just an affair. She was his plan B, his upgrade. Julia sat on the edge of the bed, reading through every message, absorbing it all with an eerie calm. By the time she finished, the ache in her chest had crystallized into something sharp and cold. She wasn't heartbroken. She was done. Vanessa might have thought she humiliated Julia that night, but what she'd actually done was hand her the match to burn the whole empire down, and Julia was ready to strike it. The next morning, Julia awoke before sunrise, her mind crystal clear, her body moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had already mourned and was now executing a plan. There were no tears, no second guesses. Everything she had once felt for Daniel had been cauterized the night before in that ballroom, and now she was simply a woman following through on consequences. She showered, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, and sat at her vanity for what might be the last time in that house. The mansion around her, 6,400 square feet of glass, marble, and false promises, no longer felt like home. It was a museum of betrayal. She walked down the grand staircase and poured herself a black coffee in the kitchen, glancing at the marble island where she had once placed birthday cakes and anniversary dinners. Not anymore. Now everything she touched would be strategic. Julia placed a manila folder on the kitchen counter. Inside were instructions for her attorney. Activate all pre-signed authorizations, freeze all joint assets pending review, notify the accountant to prepare liquidation options for her stake in the company. She had spent years preparing for the worst, quietly setting up contingencies that Daniel had agreed to, just in case, never believing she'd actually use them. But now, she saw those precautions not as paranoia, but prophecy. After leaving the folder, she moved methodically through the house, canceling subscriptions, halting auto payments on utilities, shutting down the household staff schedules. The housekeeper would be paid in full with a generous severance. The driver, too. They had done nothing wrong. Her final act in the house was in the study, Daniel's sacred space. She stepped inside, the scent of his cologne still lingering, and opened the drawer where he kept his emergency documents. She removed her copy of the power of attorney form, the one he had insisted she hold, just in case he traveled. She took it with her. Then she closed the door behind her without a sound. She didn't pack a suitcase. She didn't want a memento. She left with her purse, her phone, and the one thing no one could take from her: clarity. Outside, the morning was crisp, the sky pale blue, the street quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Her driver was already waiting, door open. Julia slid inside, and as the car pulled away from the mansion, she didn't look back once. Instead, she dialed her attorney again. "Paul," she said calmly, "initiate the stock divestment. I want everything liquidated within 72 hours. Also, make sure my name is removed from the joint accounts by noon. If they push back, remind them I have legal authority." Paul didn't ask questions. He had known Julia long enough to recognize the steel in her voice. After ending the call, she stared out the window, passing block after block of luxury and opulence. Every building they passed reminded her of something Daniel had said: "You'd be nothing without me." She almost smiled. He would soon find out just how wrong he was. Her next stop was the private bank downtown. She met with the relationship manager, a woman named Christine who greeted her with warm politeness and thinly veiled curiosity. Julia handed her a set of signed documents. "I need to transfer these funds to a trust under my name only, effective immediately." Christine blinked, scanned the paperwork, and then nodded. "Understood. We'll expedite everything." Within 40 minutes, Julia had secured $3.8 million in liquid assets. It was just the beginning. Next came the calls to the travel concierge, canceling their Maldives trip, the Aspen Chalet, and the yacht cruise in Greece, all booked under her membership, all funded by her accounts. Daniel wouldn't even know they were canceled until the confirmations bounced back. By noon, she had shut down their shared credit cards, revoked his access to the digital wallets she managed, and notified the family office to pause all disbursements pending new instructions. He would open his financial dashboard that evening and find blanks. No balances. No access. No power. Just silence. Julia then checked into a hotel under an alias she had once used for discreet travel. She wasn't hiding, she was observing. Watching how long it would take for Daniel to realize that the woman he had dismissed as useless had quietly dismantled his comfort in a single morning. She sat by the window, sipping tea as the city moved around her, and waited. Waited for the first message, the first sign of panic, the first indication that Daniel Stratton had finally understood what he had lost. Not a trophy wife. Not a silent partner. But the woman who had made his kingdom possible, and now was watching it crumble. By the time Daniel realized something was wrong, the damage was already done. It began with a declined card at his favorite lunch spot, an embarrassment he chalked up to a glitch. But then came the texts from his executive assistant about a frozen corporate account, the CFO's panicked call about a sudden change in board voting rights, and the alert from his private banker that Julia had requested a full divestment of her shares. One after another, the pillars of his empire began to shift, all tied back to the one person he had underestimated most. Julia had always been the quiet strategist in their relationship. When Daniel launched Stratton and Blake, she was the one who helped him write the initial pitch deck, network with angel investors, and review legal contracts line by line late into the night. He was the face, the voice, the ambition, but she was the structure. She never asked for recognition. She was content building behind the scenes, letting him shine. That's why he never saw her as a threat. He mistook her silence for weakness. But what he forgot, what Vanessa never knew, was that Julia was the second largest stakeholder in the firm, holding 17% of the equity and possessing certain privileges he had once offered freely, arrogantly, assuming she'd never use them. At the time, he saw it as a romantic gesture, a signal of trust. "If anything happens to me," he had said, handing her the documents years ago, "I want you to have full control. You've earned it." She had signed the papers and stored them safely, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Now they served as the blueprint of his unraveling. From her hotel suite, Julia coordinated with attorneys and financial advisors across 3 time zones. Her tone was always calm, her instructions precise. She wasn't acting out of emotion. This was not a reaction, it was a response. She didn't care about gossip or revenge porn headlines. She cared about control. And now she had all of it. Daniel's firm had thrived in large part because of her silent contributions. Compliance systems she had implemented, vendors she had vetted, board members she had recommended. With her shares, she could force a vote on any executive decision. With the clauses in their prenuptial agreement, updated 5 years ago at his own request, she could demand compensation if he engaged in behavior that harmed her reputation or financial standing. Vanessa, the smug mistress who had mocked her in public, had unknowingly triggered all of it. One line, "useless woman," had activated clauses, witnesses, and timelines that now worked like gears in a perfect machine. Julia didn't need to shout. She let the numbers do the talking. By the end of the week, 3 key contracts were suspended pending a new board review. The corporate Amex accounts were frozen, and the luxury condo in Manhattan, purchased jointly, was in the process of being sold. Julia had insisted her name remain on every significant asset Daniel ever acquired. It was never about ownership. It was about leverage. Now it was her weapon. Daniel tried calling, 56 times. His name filled her screen like a broken alarm. She didn't answer. She didn't block him. She just let the calls ring and ring until his desperation reached a crescendo. Then came the emails, pleading at first, then angry, then confused. "What are you doing?" "You're overreacting. Let's talk about this." But Julia knew better. The man who stood silently while she was publicly humiliated had nothing left to say that could possibly matter. She forwarded the emails to her legal team without reading past the subject lines. From the outside, it looked like a power couple going through a rough patch. But within the financial and legal corridors of their world, the whispers were already spreading. The quiet wife was making moves, smart ones, ruthless ones. Julia knew Daniel's allies would start backing away. Investors didn't like drama. They liked certainty. And Julia, for the first time in a long time, was the most certain figure in the room. The irony wasn't lost on her. He had called her useless. But now, without her, everything was starting to fall apart, and he had no one to blame but himself. At exactly 2 a.m., Julia sat alone in her hotel suite, surrounded by open laptops, legal documents, and a bottle of untouched champagne. The city outside her window pulsed with nightlife. But in her world, everything was quiet, clinical, and precise. This was the hour she had chosen to execute the final phase, when Daniel would be asleep, drunk, or distracted, and when the system's updates would go unnoticed until it was too late. She initiated every action with cold clarity. First, she logged into the cloud server where all household accounts were managed. One by one, she revoked Daniel's access, the streaming services, smart home controls, the biometric locks to their Hamptons villa, even the Tesla app. Then she moved to the travel portals, canceling all future itineraries, flights, resort bookings, luxury car rentals. His calendar, once filled with indulgent escapes, was now blank. Next, she opened the digital vault that housed their tax documents and historical financial reports. She downloaded every file, stored them in a secure external drive, then changed the passwords and triggered a backup wipe, one that would be irreversible. There would be no receipts for him to trace, no paper trail to salvage. She wasn't just locking him out. She was erasing him from the very systems he thought he owned. The power of administrative control, something Daniel had never bothered to learn, was now her scepter. At 2:47 a.m., she called the internal counsel at Stratton & Blake. The man sounded drowsy but alert. "Activate Clause 19, she said simply. There was silence, then a sharp inhale. Are you sure? Yes. Clause 19. Effective immediately. Clause 19 was a little-known provision written into the firm's original bylaws, a contingency protocol allowing for an emergency shareholder-triggered audit and review of executive conduct, particularly in cases of reputational risk. She had insisted on it during the company's second funding round. Daniel had barely glanced at it. He had signed it with a joke. If anyone needs to be audited, it's me. Now that joke had become his nightmare. The firm's internal compliance team would be required to freeze all discretionary budgets, suspend Daniel's signing authority, and flag any transactions above $10,000 for manual approval. It wasn't permanent, but it was enough. Enough to stall him. Enough to terrify the board. Enough to make every investor ask, what did Daniel do to trigger this? Julia didn't stop there. She activated alerts on all remaining joint assets and moved her name to primary holder status wherever possible. Her lawyer, working across multiple jurisdictions, had pre-cleared every step. She knew exactly how far she could go without triggering legal retaliation, and how to edge just past the line without blinking. At 3:20 a.m., she initiated the digital severance. She logged into their shared photo storage, years of memories, vacations, anniversary dinners, blurry selfies, and those silly montages Daniel used to make when he was trying to win her back after fights. All of it. Archived, downloaded, deleted. She wasn't angry. She was done. She moved on to their shared playlists, their reading lists, the couple's blog they started during the early years. Deleted, deleted, deleted. Erased like she had never been part of his world, even though she had built it brick by brick. The only thing she left untouched was a folder labeled Prenup Addendums. She wanted him to see that, to open it and realize she had known, years ago, that something like this might happen, that she had planned for it. At 3:55 a.m., Julia sat back, her fingers finally still. She closed every tab, powered down every device, and stood. Her reflection in the mirror was steady, almost serene. No tears, no mess. Just a woman who had walked through fire and come out gleaming. The final act of the night came with a handwritten letter. Not to Daniel, but to herself. It was brief, no more than a few lines. A reminder that this wasn't about revenge. It was about liberation. You are not what they said you were. You are what you chose to become. She folded the note, slipped it into her purse, and stepped out onto the balcony. The city was silent, unaware of the storm that had just passed through its corporate corridors. She took a deep breath of cold night air, closed her eyes, and smiled. By the time Daniel awoke, everything would be different, and he would never be able to trace where it began, because the erasure was total, invisible, irrevocable. By sunrise, Julia had already landed in a different city, arriving quietly in a private terminal using credentials tied to one of her older LLCs, an entity Daniel never paid attention to, a detail he found boring when she once tried to explain it over dinner. Now, that same entity would serve as the launchpad for her final, most devastating maneuver. She checked into a discreet executive suite, greeted by a financial advisor who had flown in from Zurich at her request. This wasn't about hiding money. This was about redirecting control. Sitting across from him, Julia slid a flash drive across the polished table. All relevant documentation. You'll find the latest share certificates, transfer authorizations, and the silent partnership agreement. The advisor nodded, reviewing the files methodically. You're liquidating everything? Yes, all 17 million. I want full disassociation from Stratton and Blake by Monday. The man blinked. Understood. Julia leaned back in the chair as the wheels of legal detachment began to turn. The shares she held, once gifted during their second anniversary in a moment of romantic idealism, were no longer sentimental tokens. They were weapons. Her divestment wouldn't just impact Daniel financially, it would trigger a market response. The firm's internal structure depended heavily on the illusion of stability. Her shares were non-voting, yes, but her departure would create questions. Why is she leaving? Why now? What does she know? Investors would start whispering. Competitors would start circling. Julia's legal team had already prepared statements, press buffers, and clauses that would shield her from accusations of sabotage. Technically, she was simply moving on, reclaiming her independence. But in the world Daniel lived in, perception was everything. Her exit would read like a red flag dipped in gasoline. Over the next 2 hours, wire transfers moved like veins of fire through accounts in Liechtenstein, Singapore, and the Caymans. None of it illegal, all of it structured. By the time the process was done, Julia no longer held a single share in Stratton and Blake. And Daniel, by contract, would receive immediate notice, delivered by courier, complete with a personal clause she'd inserted years ago. In the event of full divestment by Partner B, Partner A agrees to forfeit shared bonus incentives for the fiscal year. That clause alone would cost him close to $3 million. She could almost hear his voice, confused, then furious, then desperate. She imagined the board meeting, the pale faces, the frantic attempts to interpret the move. But no one would know the real reason. No one would understand what had happened in that ballroom, or what words had sliced through her like glass. That was the beauty of it. Her revenge didn't need to be loud to be complete. She spent the afternoon finalizing paperwork, signing under aliases, initials, quiet little gestures that wielded immense power. When her phone finally buzzed with the alert, divestment process complete, all funds secured, she allowed herself a single exhale. $17 million. A number Daniel had bragged about during interviews, claiming he and Julia had built something from nothing. Now she had extracted every cent of her contribution and then some. And he would be left scrambling not just for money, but for narrative. She had removed herself from his story. Cleanly. Legally. Permanently. Back in her suite, Julia poured a glass of wine. Not the cheap red Daniel used to insist was just as good as the expensive stuff, but a vintage she loved. One he had once mocked as pretentious. She toasted no one. She didn't need witnesses. Her victory was not for show. It was for her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned the same deep green as the dress she'd worn that night, the one Vanessa had sneered at. Funny how people thought elegance was weakness. Funny how no one noticed the blade behind the silk. With one decisive move, she had walked away from a man, a company, and a life that had tried to erase her. Instead, she had erased her ties, extracted her worth, and left a crater in their place. She didn't burn the bridge. She sold it, and made a profit. That was the power of knowing your value, and of making sure no one could ever take it from you again. It started with a vibration on the nightstand. Then another. And another. By the time Julia awoke, the screen of her phone was glowing with notifications, calls, messages, emails, all from Daniel. 56 missed calls, each more frantic than the last. The voicemail previews ranged from confused to desperate. Julia, we need to talk, please. Where are you? What's going on? You can't just walk away like this. You have no idea what you're doing. Please, just talk to me. She didn't respond. She didn't even open them. There was nothing in those recordings she needed to hear. Nothing she hadn't predicted. The man who stood by silently as she was humiliated now wanted words. But Julia had already said everything she needed to through action. She moved to the suite's kitchenette, made herself a tea, and settled by the window. She was calm. Not detached, not cold. Calm. There was a difference. Calm came from knowing the storm had already passed, and that she had survived it untouched. As she sipped, her phone buzzed again, this time from Paul, her lawyer. He's been trying to call the board. They're deferring to compliance and won't reinstate his signing privileges without a full review. Another message followed. Also, he tried to reverse the share transfer. Too late. We filed everything last night. Irreversible. Julia typed a single-word response. Good. The rest of the day moved quietly. She attended 2 video calls with her new financial advisor, reviewed offers for advisory roles at smaller firms, opportunities that had flooded in as soon as word spread she was no longer tied to Stratton and Blake, and sent a message to the concierge to extend her stay. It was all beautifully uneventful. Until the knock. It came just after 9 p.m., soft but insistent. Julia, wrapped in a robe and still holding a novel she'd barely started, rose with measured steps. She checked the peephole. It was him. Daniel stood there, his suit wrinkled, tie loosened, his face drawn with fatigue and confusion. He looked like a man who had run out of defenses, Someone who had finally realized the house was on fire and that the doors were locked from the outside. Julia didn't open the door. She watched. He knocked again, gently. Then a whisper. "Julia, please, I just want to talk." Silence. "I didn't mean for any of this. I didn't think you'd really—" He trailed off. She could see it now. He truly hadn't believed she was capable. All those years of quiet support, of being in the background, had created a myth in his mind. That she was dependent, docile, harmless. And now he was face to face with the version of her he had never taken the time to see. She stepped back from the door and returned to her seat, leaving him standing in the hallway with his regrets. She didn't need closure. She didn't need apologies spoken through a locked door. Everything she had to say was already written in the balance sheets, the legal notices, the silence that followed his humiliation. After several minutes, the knocking stopped. She heard him sigh, then footsteps retreating. She waited a few more beats before returning to her tea, still warm, untouched. The phone vibrated once more, Daniel again, with a final message. "I didn't think you'd leave. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Julia didn't even open it. Instead, she placed her phone face down, took a sip, and allowed herself a single thought. He'll remember this silence longer than any scream. He had made his choices. And now, he was living the consequence of thinking she was someone who would simply endure. 56 calls, a knock on a door, and still, no way back. Because once Julia walked away, she didn't look over her shoulder. She only moved forward. Quietly, powerfully, entirely free. The downfall didn't come like a thunderclap. It came like a leak, slow and relentless, eroding Daniel's carefully constructed image from the inside. It started with a memo, standard compliance procedure, sent to all upper-level staff, announcing a temporary review of executive spending privileges due to recent shareholder activity. At first, Daniel brushed it off, calling it a routine audit. But the silence in the office hallways was different. The glances lasted a beat too long. His assistant no longer scheduled investor calls without confirmation. Meetings were postponed. Board members stopped replying instantly. Then came the press inquiry. Just one email from a mid-tier financial blog asking why a key stakeholder had liquidated their holdings so abruptly. Daniel crafted a canned response, full of vague optimism and legal jargon. But in the world of finance, perception shapes truth. By the next week, the article was picked up by larger outlets. Quiet power move, Julia Stratton exits Stratton and Blake amid unusual internal freeze. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't a confident CEO. He was a man under scrutiny. Investors began to panic, not because Julia left, but because she left so completely. No interviews, no statements, no scandal. Just a surgical withdrawal. That kind of silence screamed louder than any tabloid headline. And Vanessa, she hadn't been prepared for the fallout. What started as flirtation turned power grab turned humiliation, now stood exposed under the bright light of public skepticism. Internally, whispers spread that she was the real reason for Julia's departure, that the firm's stability had been compromised by the affair. HR launched an internal review. Vanessa was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Daniel fought to keep her, but every protest he made only confirmed the rumors. The board, once full of allies, turned cold. His credibility began to decay. Clients withdrew. 2 major accounts pulled out citing concerns about governance. A third, an international partner Julia had personally recruited, refused to renew their contract. Daniel's empire began to crack. The press labeled it executive turbulence. Internally, it was chaos. Staff morale plummeted. Quarterly projections collapsed. The stock dipped just enough to trigger automatic alerts. At home, Daniel faced empty rooms, unanswered calls, and the echo of his own hubris. No one warned him that losing Julia would be like removing the queen from the board. His moves were now clumsy, reactive. He fired his PR manager, blamed the marketing team, berated the CFO. Nothing helped. The truth was too heavy to spin. He had lost the person who kept the system together. Julia watched it all from a distance, not with glee, not with vindictiveness, but with calm detachment. She wasn't here to enjoy the wreckage. She had simply ensured that every brick she had laid was reclaimed. Without her, the foundation had cracked. One morning, while reading the latest article, Stratton and Blake faces critical restructuring talks, Julia received a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of Vanessa exiting the firm's building with a single box of belongings, face turned away from the camera. The message said only, "She's gone." Julia didn't reply. She didn't forward it. She deleted it. Vanessa had gotten what she deserved, not because of some melodramatic revenge plot, but because she had bet on a man too weak to protect her and too arrogant to think he'd ever need to. Julia had left quietly, but her absence had become a presence more powerful than any confrontation. Daniel now stood alone in the very tower they had built together, surrounded by hollow echoes and fading loyalty. And Julia? She was already steps ahead, her name untarnished, her wealth secured, and her dignity intact. The story people would tell wasn't of a woman betrayed. It was of a woman who vanished and took the scaffolding of an empire with her. No headlines needed, just consequence. Julia didn't vanish. She evolved. With the $17 million carefully distributed across a series of trusts, investments, and philanthropic ventures, she reinvented her life not as an escapee of tragedy, but as the architect of her own freedom. She relocated to a coastal town, quiet and elegant, far from the skyscrapers and boardrooms that once defined her existence. There, she purchased a modest yet stunning villa overlooking the ocean, not for status but for peace. Her days began with sunrise walks and ended with pages of books she never had time to read. She volunteered at a local foundation, mentored young women in finance, and began consulting quietly for female-led startups. Choosing her projects, setting her terms. People in town knew her simply as Ms. Stratton, a sophisticated and private woman with kind eyes and impeccable taste. No one pried, and she never brought up her past. The silence of her new life wasn't emptiness. It was sanctuary. Meanwhile, Daniel spiraled. The company teetered on the edge of a forced acquisition. With the board losing faith and investors applying pressure, he was pushed into taking a sabbatical he hadn't asked for. Publicly, it was framed as a leadership transition. Privately, it was exile. Alone in his penthouse, stripped of power, reputation shattered, he found himself scrolling through old photos. Images of Julia laughing on their anniversary in Paris, of her reading reports late at night with glasses sliding down her nose, of quiet dinners where she offered insights he once dismissed as overcautious. The depth of his regret was suffocating. He tried to reach her again. Letters, gifts, apologies through mutual friends, all unanswered. Julia never responded, not because she was bitter, but because there was nothing left to say. His remorse could not undo the silence he chose the night Vanessa humiliated her. It could not rebuild the trust he shattered with arrogance. The world around him shrank, and the echoes of his choices grew louder. Vanessa, too, had disappeared, moved out of the city, reportedly working in a minor role for another firm. She had lost the game she thought she was winning. Daniel was left with the wreckage. Not just the loss of Julia, but the realization that the empire he had built was never truly his. It was theirs. And without her, it was dust. One autumn afternoon, Julia sat at her desk, the soft hum of waves outside her window, when she received a package. No return address. Inside, a single photo, their wedding day, now faded at the edges, and a note that simply read, "I see everything now. I'm sorry." She placed the photo in a drawer, tucked it away, and closed it gently. She didn't need revenge anymore. She had her life back. Her power hadn't come from retaliation. It came from restraint, from dignity, from knowing she had chosen herself when no one else did. She wasn't angry. She wasn't waiting. She was living. And for the first time in years, she felt whole. Time, that ultimate revealer, did its work with quiet precision. Months passed, then a year. The story of Julia Stratton became something of a corporate legend, an elegant myth whispered in executive lounges and mentorship circles. No interviews were ever granted, no tell-all memoirs published, yet everyone seemed to know the outline. The silent wife, publicly humiliated, who walked away with millions and left an empire trembling in her absence. Young women in boardrooms spoke her name with admiration. Lawyers cited her prenup clauses as models of foresight, and financial advisors referenced her divestment as one of the cleanest, most effective withdrawals they had ever seen. But Julia never engaged with the myth. She let it grow on its own, like vines over old stone. Her justice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was built into every breath of her new life, into every sunrise she greeted on her veranda, every moment of calm in her soul, every step she took knowing she had nothing to prove and nothing to explain. She never watched the fall of Stratton and Blake, but she heard whispers. The firm was sold in parts, acquired by a larger conglomerate. Its name stripped down to just Blake Capital. Daniel's name was erased from the masthead, and his reputation never fully recovered. His face, once gracing magazine covers, now rarely appeared in public. Some said he moved to a quieter city. Others said he took up teaching finance at a community college. Julia didn't know, and she didn't ask. His chapter in her life was closed, completely. What remained was a new narrative, one she wrote with intention. She established a foundation under her mother's name, focused on funding education for women seeking careers in business law and finance. She became a keynote speaker, quietly, selectively, at women's leadership retreats, always under her maiden name. She shared insights, not wounds, lessons, not bitterness. And every now and then, when someone approached her nervously and asked, "Are you the Julia from that story?" she would smile gently and say, "I'm just someone who remembered her worth." That, more than anything, was the true revenge. Not the loss Daniel suffered, not the collapse of a company, not even the disgrace of a mistress. It was Julia's complete reclamation of self. Her refusal to scream or stoop or fight in the mud. Her decision to walk away with grace and take everything with her. Poetic justice wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet moments. The decision to cancel the yacht before he boarded it, the timing of the divestment, the locked door when he came knocking. Every action was precise, every silence deliberate. She had given them all a chance to treat her better. They chose arrogance. She chose power. And in the end, while they scrambled to understand how everything unraveled, Julia simply lived. Free. Whole. Unbothered. Her story didn't end with applause or vindication. It ended exactly where she wanted it to, on her terms, with her dignity untouched and her future entirely her own.